The earliest records of slavery date back to the beginning of civilization and show up in almost every major culture. There were forced laborers, house slaves, concubines, and forced soldiers. Often these slaves were viewed as subhuman and inferior, and thus their mistreatment was justified in the minds of their owners. Although in some places slavery was banned or viewed as morally wrong, it wasn't until the 18th century that movements for the abolition of slavery began to form. Long before then, the American continents were discovered, and the transatlantic slave trade blossomed. Slave ships transported African slaves to the Western world under inhumane conditions, with hundreds of slaves packed into one ship, shackled together in cramped quarters for months at a time. The most brutal part of the journey was known as the Middle Passage. During that time, 1 in 7 slaves died, and the disease-ridden corpses were left shackled to the living for days or even weeks at a time. Appalled by the horrifying conditions and spurred on by ideas of equality, abolitionists such as William Wilberforce or Thomas Clarkson began to fight for governments to outlaw the slave trade. In 1775, the first American anti-slavery group was formed, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. In 1787, a famous association called the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade began in Britain. In 1791, the slave revolt began in Haiti. 3 years later, in 1794, France abolished slavery, only to have it reintroduced by Napoleon in 1802. In 1804, Haiti won independence, and in 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade. 1 year later, the United States outlawed the slave trade as well. In 1813, Sweden and Norway followed in their footsteps, as did Spain in 1820. In 1831, France re-abolished the slave trade, and 2 years later, in 1833, Britain outlawed all slavery. France finally re-abolished slavery in 1848, and in 1853, Brazil ended the slave trade. In 1860, the last slave ship arrived in America, and 5 years later, after a bloody civil war, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and slavery was made illegal. 2 years later, in 1867, Cuba abolished the slave trade, and in 1886, they abolished slavery altogether. In 1888, Brazil outlawed slavery. Today, slavery is illegal in all countries throughout the world. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass gave a speech in 1865 after the 13th Amendment was passed. He said, "Slavery has been fruitful in giving itself names. It has been called the peculiar institution, the social system, and the impediment. It has been called a great many names, and it will call itself by yet another name. And you and I, and all of us, had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume, in what new skin this old snake will come forth." Douglass was right. Slavery survived abolition, and when it began to show its face again, it came under new names: bonded labor, debt bondage, attached labor, restavek. In Haiti, sex slaves are referred to in the common language as there for that. But in America, the most common phrase by far is human trafficking. It is modern-day slavery, every bit as brutal and dehumanizing as the slavery of the past, but it's a hidden crime with victims who are hard to identify. It is estimated that there are 27 million slaves in the world today. They are trapped in a life they did not choose, forced through violence, starvation, or fraud, to work as prostitutes, soldiers, or miners, as agricultural, domestic, restaurant, or factory workers, with little or no pay. The slave trade is the world's third largest illegal market, generating over $32 billion annually. Somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people are trafficked across international borders every year, and at least 14,500 of these people are brought into America. 50% of all slaves worldwide are children, and unlike the slavery of the past, when the modern equivalent of a slave's asking price ranged between $30,000 to $40,000, the average price of a slave is $90. Many of them cost far less. In India, poverty and lack of health care, clean water, or food drives many to accept loans from corrupt and wealthy men. In order to repay their debt, these people are forced to work under harsh conditions until the master declares their debt repaid. These masters claim that due to high interest, the debts are growing instead of being paid off, and if the slaves attempt to resist, they enforce their claims with threats and violence. 80% of enslaved farm workers in India sold their freedom for less than $11. Across the globe, slavery is one of the most prevalent crimes. In Africa, slave raids are part of the civil warfare. Many are forced into labor, and others are forced to become soldiers. In Europe, there is an increasingly high demand for prostitutes, a demand that is met by the sex slavery of millions of women. Regardless of the type of slave or the location, most slaves are beaten, raped, unhealthy, or underfed. People rarely escape, but when they do, they are plagued by healthcare problems, including mental illnesses such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Only a few of them are able to find assistance to be rehabilitated into society, and many feel that they have no other choice than to return to the slavery they have tried to escape. In spite of the widespread damage caused by human trafficking, there was no legislation in place to solve it until 2000, when Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Before this point, traffickers often were punished for lesser offenses, thereby escaping just punishment. Instead, the slaves were often punished more harshly than the traffickers due to the penalties in place for illegal immigration. Now, there is legislation against human trafficking in 27 states, and within the U.S. Department of State, there is an office which determines whether or not trade sanctions should be enacted against countries that do nothing to prevent or end slavery within their borders. As a result, other nations have enacted measures of legislation against human trafficking. In spite of this, not much progress has been made in the fight against slavery. The trade sanctions are often waived instead of being enforced. In 2003, the budget for fighting human trafficking was only 0.33% of the budget for combating drug trafficking, an insufficient amount for such an enormous task. In order for slavery to truly be ended, governments need to enforce the laws against trafficking, rehabilitate the victims, and to eliminate some of the factors that put people at risk for trafficking: lack of accessible health care, lack of education, unemployment, and homelessness. To create an environment that prevents slavery, governments must ensure affordable health care, public education systems, and employment programs. Corporations and individuals would have to take responsibility for their purchases and only buy things that were produced without slave labor. Modern abolitionists form organizations that raise awareness, petition for legislation, provide rehabilitation, and work to prevent slavery for those who are at risk. It is their hope that through the joint efforts of people worldwide, that slavery will be eradicated. The greatest challenge for these abolitionists is to show the truth of slavery in a way that motivates people to action, because as long as the majority of people do nothing, the slave trade will continue. Without having been exposed to slavery, people are often unaware or indifferent to the statistics. Abolitionists today follow in the footsteps of those who came before, such as Frederick Douglass, who also once said, "I expose slavery, because to expose it is to kill it. Slavery is one of those monsters of darkness, to whom the light of truth is death."